Well, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. So 3.15 has been a polarizing release. I've liked it, a lot of people have hated it, and so today Chris Wilson went on the podcast with Tarkat, RazeQT, Nugian, Octavian, and Ziggy D, 5 fairly high-profile streamers, and had a discussion where Chris basically said, just ask all your questions. These streamers sort of run quite a range of opinions, from people who are more definitely outspoken as being quite hostile to some of the changes in 3.15, such as Tarkat, I think, has been quite disapproving of the changes, through to people that have been quite happy with them, like RazeQT, who's probably reasonably close to me in opinions on the changes, and then there's a bunch of people who are somewhere in between. So this was intended to be a serious discussion, and it was. And some absolute legend over on Reddit has put together a summary of basically, like, almost a transcription of the video. I'll put a link to their original post down in the description of this video below. But basically, there's a transcription that is not word perfect for the whole thing, but that will cover the vast majority of the points of discussion that were made. I just want to go through a few of the things that I thought were most interesting, and give you some info on where you can find more of it. Just firstly, though, we're going to be talking about the Atlas, the future of the Atlas in this, and I just wanted to point out, I've run a few polls on the channel recently asking viewers' opinions on what the best parts and worst parts of Atlas progression were. I thought I'd share all that info with you. This was taken something like 24 hours ago, so the numbers might have changed a little bit since then. But you'll see that there's a bias towards people who complete 12 and 24 challenges in my viewership, which is what I expected. Obviously, most of the Path of Exile player base are in the under 12 category by number of players. But in terms of number of hours played, I kind of expect that 12 to 23 challenge players probably play the most hours per league. So you'll see that there's not very many people that do 40 challenges that watch my stuff, and that's because there's just not many of them in the community that do 40. People that generally do 36 make up about an eighth, same as the people that do under 12. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the context of these opinions. But firstly, I asked people, how do you feel about the complexity of the Atlas? And I found the most popular, so there's a plurality opinion, there's no majority opinion here, but the plurality opinion was it's overly complex. Then of the people that felt that it was not too complex, they thought it's mostly intuitive, but there's a couple of complex parts I didn't get. I was expecting an absolute majority for the it's mostly intuitive comment, with a couple of complex parts I don't get. So that was my expectation going into the poll, but I certainly didn't ask any questions. That would be my answer myself as well. Well, I mean, like, I generally know those complex parts, but things like strategies for isolating the last map in a region so that you can unlock your Atlas bonus, stuff like that can be really messy. Having to look up horizon orb charts to do things like that. There's a bunch of things where I need to consult external resources as well. Then there's a question, which part of the Atlas experience do you find the most fun and the least fun? And this will be interesting because there's, like, obviously a lot of people don't get all of the way through the Atlas. And so that means that there's a bit of a bias towards selecting the first option in both cases, just because people are going to only comment on the ones that they've gotten to. What's interesting, though, is that the third section, which is tier 14 to 16 progress phase. So at this point, you are only running tier 14 plus maps in order to spawn Conquerors. The Conquerors have become rarer, or at least they become rarer during this. Cyrus has started to appear, but your Atlas is mostly not finished. You don't have all your Maven points. Now, this is my favorite part of the Atlas at the moment. And that means that the changes that get mentioned that are planned are going to make the Atlas worse for me. But it's pretty clear that there's almost a majority of people find this as the worst part of the Atlas. And in fact, once you remove the people that haven't done enough mapping to have an informed opinion, it's a majority of people feel that this phase is the worst part of Atlas progression at the moment. So this is once you get your 16th Watchstone and start unlocking progress in your 4 Watchstone maps, but before you have Awakening level 8. For me, the worst part of the Atlas is actually when you've got everything absolutely perfect. At that point, I'm waiting for the next economic reset. I guess I'd play standard if that was what I wanted to, if that was the phase that I thought was the best. But again, that certainly is a bunch of people's favorite part of the Atlas. What's noticeable is the popularity of two specific phases. Early fast progress, so that's when you're just sort of just get into the Atlas, everything's new and fresh. And then when you're nearly done, so you don't have, there's a couple of things you have, there's still objectives left to go for. These parts are the most popular in the Atlas. So keep that in mind because there's a bit that's going to come up later where we'll be talking about that. So some of the points that I found. Firstly, Chris talks about the changes to Act 1 and their reception. And he says that from watching streamers play through Act 1, and this isn't just streamers that are, top tier players like, people like RazeQT that are some of the best players in the game. They were also watching people who are, streaming Path of Exile for the first time or close to the first time. Chris said that most of the streamers did like Act 1 more than they used to. The key thing was that their issues with mana tended to sour their opinions on things. Those mana issues were dealt with in the 3.15.0.d emergency patch that came out during week 1 of the league. And so that walked back some of the changes to support gems. I kind of feel that I feel like there could have been a better solution to mana, but let's just put it this way. The 3.15.0d state of the game is better than 3.15.0 was by quite a bit, and the mana was the main issue there. One other thing that he says in this point is that 3.15 was all of the planned nerfs at once, except for an upcoming change to Fortify, which is elaborated a bit later in the thing, but mostly about linking it to the amount of melee damage you've done. So basically, there's a number of buffs that are planned, but this was not the first salvo of a multi-wave massive slowdown of the game. The idea was that they wanted to get everything in one hit, and then to buy room for future power creep. I'm not sure if this was the best solution. I kind of expected GGG to tackle power creep at some point by doing a level cap increase. So just pushing out the game to level 120 and allowing monsters to go up to monster level 100, 105, 110 or whatever, in order to provide an ongoing challenge there. So that was my expectation of how they deal with this. They've chosen to deal with it through a bunch of nerfs instead. But basically, by buying that room for future power creep, then that means that in the future, they can buff an underperforming skill, and not be concerned that that's going to trivialize areas of the game. A little bit later in this piece, Chris talks about not being happy with the present state of defense and wants more options available. Now, in my opinion, there should be a massive overhaul of player defenses at some point, with a goal of changing time to kill against players. Currently, if you watch your deaths frame by frame in this game, you'll find that time to kill. So time to kill is the period from when you leave full life, or if you're not a full life character, if you're a low life character or whatever, if you leave whatever your sort of standard mapping life pool and energy shield pool is, the time between that and you hitting actually dead is usually of the order 250 to 300 milliseconds in my experience. Now that's faster than realistic human reaction times. And one good example of this is the streamer Mathel's death on his Spectral Helix character, which like a lot of people were saying he got one shot. I actually looked at it frame by frame because he posted it to his YouTube channel, and it was a 13 frame kill. So 13 frames, he's at full life, and then 400 and something milliseconds, 433 milliseconds later, he's dead. In that period, he's taken 3 savage hits. The first one chunked him from 4,500 to 1,800, to 1,600. By the time the second hit came in, which was on frame 12, he'd regenerated to 1,800 life. The second hit chunked him to 800, and then the third hit, which was on the very next frame, was the outright kill. So that was an example of what I feel is a typical death in Path of Exile. It's a bunch of savage hits taken in a short time period in which you can't really react all that much. There are tools that you can use, like had Mathel's character had some spell block, which wasn't likely to happen at that time in the game, then he'd have a chance of surviving it. Had he had a cast when damage taken Steel Skin, or cast when damage taken Molten Shell, or cast when damage taken Immortal Call, he might have survived it. But he didn't have those things, and I think I would have certainly died in the same situation that he did. But what I think is important is that 300 milliseconds is not or 430 milliseconds is not a satisfying time to kill on a player. I think that they should have a massive overhaul, sweeping changes to defenses, with a goal of time to kill being between 3/4 of a second and 1 1/4 seconds. But this would take a suite of simultaneous changes. I think they should increase player hit point pools, lower player life recovery at the top end significantly. So that's things like putting a cooldown on life gain on block, putting a cooldown on life gain on kill effects, lowering the numbers on the agnostic, and then dropping the block and dodge maximum realistic achievable numbers to 60% instead of 75%. With this suite of changes, I think you would see that you would still die about as much as you do now, but your time to kill would be considerably higher because you've got the, if your player hit point pools increase 40 to 70%, then that's the sort of thing that would allow you to, to react during a period where you're in trouble and have more near misses and less unfair feeling deaths. That I think would be the goal. But anyways, that's my opinion. That's not what was discussed here, beyond the fact that they're saying that they're not happy with the current state of player defenses. A little bit later, they talk about future Flask changes that are coming. So firstly, they weren't happy with the exact way that the Instilling and Enkindling Orbs came out. They're thinking of increasing the numbers on Enkindling Orbs and changing a couple of things about how Instilling Orbs work. But ultimately in the future, they're thinking of changing the Flask mod system significantly so that it'll move towards a tiered system with top tier Flasks being something that will have better rolls possible on them. So this would mean that, say, a monster level 6, an item level 60 Diamond Flask will have access to one set of mods, and then an item level 80 Flask might have access to more. The view is that the top tier mods will be 3 times as strong as the bottom tier, and that these would, that the bottom tier ones would probably come online very early in play, whereas the top tier ones would be much later. I'm curious to see how that plays out. I think that it's going to put a lot more pressure on Alteration Orbs in general. Alteration Orbs are sort of something that every time GGG introduce some new mechanic that requires that only allows magic items, and this came up with the Maven Watchstones, you ended up with a lot of additional demand for Alteration Orbs. I'm curious to see how this works. I'm going to withhold judgment on it at the moment, just that it'll be interesting to see. Chris does think, though, talking about Instilling and Enkindling Orbs, that it was a mistake to make it hard to get the specific mod you want. And so here this is talking about the fact that it's 1 in 16 to get I think it's the Instilling Orb, the one that causes your flasks to trigger on an effect, that it's 1 in 16 to get this, that this was a mistake, partly because just variance is really cruel on a 1 in 16 chance. Whilst plenty of players will get it in 10, there'll also be a significant percentage of players that don't get their desired flask effect by 50. And I think there's some talk about making these available as bench crafts at some point. And that'll be in the near future. One thing that was interesting, Octavian responded here talking about the Flask tier effects with, and I'll quote this verbatim from the transcript, which is, I think one thing we have to be careful of with tiers, core defensive layers in a build that a character relies upon should not be gated behind a tier of content you can't access. I think that's what Flasks were papering over throughout Path of Exile, and one of the larger pain points. I think this opinion comes because, I'm a Trade League player and I'm also a softcore player. This doesn't affect me because I can simply say, oh, okay, if I was really struggling at, say, let's say I was really struggling to break into 3 Watchstone maps, I could trade for something that I couldn't get in 2 Watchstone maps, and use that as a springboard to jump me past that. But for people that play solo self-found, hardcore, or both at once, that is much more difficult. So that's something that I think is an opinion that, whilst I don't agree with it, I think it's really worthwhile considering, because it is a factor that you need to decide: are you balancing for Path of Exile softcore trade enabled, or are you balancing for the harder modes? And if you're balancing for the harder modes, then you should definitely take Octavian's opinion into consideration and make sure that there's not that things that feel completely core to a build are not locked to, you know, monster level 86 or anything like that. The next thing that came up was some discussion of ailments. And there's the vision that the GGG team have is that damaging ailments, so ignite, poison, and bleed, should be dealt with through reducing the damage. Where the team want to move other ones, this is more binary effects like freeze, move those to be on skills in the Pantheon rather than items. I'm not exactly sure what I think on that. I think that definitely the idea of mitigating how severe ignite, poison, and bleed are without outright immunity is a good one. You know, I think it'd be fine if you had, say, if you could pick up items that said, you know, you take, if you, like across a suite of items, 70% reduced damage from bleeding. That would be a really solid defense against bleed whilst not completely trivializing it. So that would be something that's quite interesting. What I don't like with ailments at the moment is the probabilistic nature of the best defenses against them. I think that freeze is something that we need to have the ability to have unconditional defenses against. And whilst Arctic Armor is one solution now, and there's some talk that maybe they'd be linked to purities and things like that, I'm not sure that this is necessarily the best thing to go with. Okay, so after that comes the biggest announcement that has most excited me in this, and that is the discussion of Path of Exile hard mode. This is something that they're discussing internally and they've done a little bit of work on. And essentially, this is a different system to hardcore or to solo self-found, but one that can coexist with either or both. So essentially, you would have an 8-way split, where at the moment you've got 4-way split between trade-enabled softcore, trade-enabled hardcore, solo self-found softcore, and solo self-found hardcore. You'd now have an 8-way split, with the hard mode being an additional option that you could pick. In practice, this would mean that some of these modes would not be very popular. Just like at the moment, trade-enabled hardcore is not very popular in the game. But the concept with hard mode, and I really like this idea, it's basically the core game, but with extremely limited items. So there'll be no crafting bench, and there'll be a number of other restrictions. And the goal that they're going for here is that you can find items on the ground that are meaningful upgrades, and that this will continue all the way through the game. This was the case for those of you that have a bit of experience playing Diablo 1 or Diablo 2 back in the days. You would find that sometimes you'd get a magic item drop on the ground, and you'd look at it and you'd be like, oh wow, that's actually an upgrade for me. Whereas in Path of Exile at the moment, by the time you complete Act 1, you are mostly not interested in using anything that is not a unique item or a rare item. Sometimes you'll make an exception just because you get a feckin' leather belt of tier 3 fire resist early in the axe. But even then, you're like, I want to use a Regal Orb to upgrade this and then craft another resist on it as soon as I realistically can. So the goal that they're going for with hard mode is that modifying your items will be much more difficult. There'll be very, 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 very restricted amounts of crafting currency. And as I say, no crafting bench as well. So this is going to be something that will be a completely optional opt-in challenge mode. I'm definitely looking forward to it. Hardcore has never done it for me because at least prior to 3.15, I really hated the axe. And hardcore, I think even the best hardcore players spend a considerable percentage of their time in the axe. And then additionally to that, the other thing with hardcore that's really frustrating is when you die due to a game bug, as happened to me in the last gauntlet that I went in. That is something that just really puts you on tilt. Or a game bug, or just, so yeah, like, I find that deaths become more penalizing over time, whereas what I like about the concept of this hard mode is that deaths won't become more penalizing over time. They'll just be penalizing from early on. They'll stay the same. So you won't need to feel this urge to play increasingly conservatively as you progress. And that's why I'm really thinking it'll be good. So I'm definitely going to give that a try in 3.16, assuming that they do end up releasing it, and assuming it's something reasonably similar to the current form. One thing that's very important, though, that they do need to be very aware of is there's a number of divination cards that will need to be severely toned down in the event that they do put this together. So divination cards like the Lover that drop, that's the one that drops from all of the maps with Merveil in them, and that have a really high drop rate. So it's a set of 2 for an item level 79 unique piece of jewelry. That's an example of a divination card that would need its drop rate severely curtailed, as would the divination cards for common currency items like alchemy orbs, and additionally essences would need to be constrained quite a bit for the design concept to work. But I'm really interested to see what it would look like, you know, the idea of progressing as far as you can on a 4-link. That sounds like something that could be a lot of fun. Quite a bit later, Chris starts talking about the concept of aspirational content. This is something that I've mentioned a couple of times before on this channel, and I think the best example of this is Uber Atzri at release. So when Uber Atzri came out, I was a casual player who had gotten to maps once. I gave Atzri a couple of shots, normal Atzri this is, and couldn't get past the twin Val over Souls fight. So in this context, like Atzri was clearly something that I could aspire towards beating by improving. You know, I needed to improve at the game quite a bit. But then there was this Uber fight that was just so much harder, that was there as something that I knew, holy hell, I've got to improve a lot to get to that. And I really liked that. You know, it was like, you know, there's no end of things to do in this game, was my thoughts when Uber Atzri was announced. Because for some reason they didn't announce Uber Atzri at the time. They've got a bunch of other ideas for aspirational content. And so this might include Uber versions of farmable past league content like Uber blighted maps, Uber breachstones, which would be a tier above pure breachstones, Uber domain of timeless conflict, things like that. There's no promises yet, but some of these might be in 3.16. One other thing that was really interesting in here was a philosophy that Chris outlined, which was that he said that he firmly believes that why items need to be attractive is to get to content you can't do. So he wants a situation where there is content available in the game that most players can't beat, but that they can gear up enough to get to the point of being able to do so. And ultimately, it's just up to players whether they want to go that far in the context of a league or not. You know, like sometimes, for instance, when Uber Elder first came out, I knew at the time Uber Elder was just miles beyond my abilities. I was sort of just getting to the point where I felt I could take on the Shaper. But a few leagues later, I did get to the point of beating Uber Elder, and that was fantastic too. You know, the time spent learning the Uber Elder fight, failing it 6 times, then eventually beating it on my 7th, was some of the best time I've had playing Path of Exile. And hopefully this aspirational content will be something that recaptures that. One thing, though, that needs to be really carefully managed with this, and there was no discussion of this on the podcast, is that this aspirational content can dominate trade league economies, and that's something that needs to be really carefully watched. So that's something that needs to be thought carefully about. Like, I think that Uber Atzri gets this right. Uber Atzri doesn't drop more items than normal Atzri. Uber Atzri drops different ones. The other thing that they could conceivably do is, let's say that you were to have the breach as an example here. You could have something like the Chayula fight dropping slightly higher statted versions of Chayula's items, or maybe 30 quality and influenced versions of Chayula's items, which would have some niche appeal. You know, things like that are noticeably better than the normal thing, but it's not the same thing, just more of it. Because if you do have the same thing, more of it, then the first couple of 100 people that get to this content will just flood the market for the lower tier Chayula stuff as well. So, you know, if you were one of the first 200 people to get into Uber Chayula, and all that Uber Chayula was just the same loot as normal Chayula, but 5 times as much of it, then you're going to be taking away from the value of the blessings of Chayula that drop for, you know, someone that's doing Chayula for the first time. Stuff like that. That's something that I think is a really difficult balancing thing in trade leagues. Obviously doesn't apply in solo self-found, but I think it's something that they're going to need to put a lot of thought into. So earlier we were talking about the Atlas stuff. The reason for that is that about halfway through this, there is an extensive talk about a potential crunching of the Atlas. So the concept that Chris is looking for here is moving towards having 4 regions instead of 8, with 100 maps instead of 160, and shuffling maps in and out league to league. So in the way that, say, at the moment, Hall of the Grandmasters is not on the Atlas, but most other unique maps are, you might see that some of the normal maps will come in and out of the Atlas. So one league you might have Burial Chambers available. Next league, it may not be available at all. Now, this seems to be pretty much a hard removal of the very polarizing 16 to 32 Watchstone progression phase in the Atlas, which, like I said, it's my favorite part of Atlas progression, but I can accept that that is definitely an unpopular opinion amongst my viewers. I like it because you're making rapid progress whilst you're doing non-trivial content, but obviously lots of people prefer the feeling of being already set up and established. It comes a little bit later. So that was something that was, that was really interesting to read about, and is something that I'm keen to see their future plans for. There's a bunch of systems, obviously, that will interact with this that need to be thought really long and hard about. So the first one of them is the Maven, Maven points, and so there's a lot of Atlas. There's a lot of Atlas regions, or sorry, a lot of Atlas mechanics where there's two regions that you can run a specific mechanic in. So from recollection, New Vestia and Turn's End both have passive points that support Abyss content at the moment, with New Vestia focusing on increasing the number of monsters in the map, whereas the other region, which I think is Turn's End, I could be wrong on it being Turns, but it has all of the things that affect Abyssal Depths. So would you see these merged? Would you see there be only one option for the Abyss passives? And if so, this is going to be quite tricky to balance. I don't envy trying to work out exactly what to do here, but it does seem like it'll be a change that, whilst it won't work for me, it will make a lot of people happy. So I'm sort of content to see it. The other system that's going to break with this, though, is divination cards. A lot of divination cards are tile set locked, and I kind of feel a number of them should move to be region locked. There is a bit of discussion at some point in the Baeclast episode where there's a question posed of, you've moved around divination cards by stealth in the past, and is that something you plan to keep doing because a lot of players don't like it? And Chris's response was, we don't announce changes to drop rates, but we do, well, usually, but we do announce, we are intending to announce changes to locations in the future. What I think they should do is a hard pass on all divination card drop locations and just say, all right, we are changing all divination card drop locations. The following ones are going, and then list say the 300 divination cards that are deemed to be the least special, and say this is where these 300 cards are going to drop. Then for the other 75 or whatever it is cards that are in the game, say instead, for the rest of them, we are leaving the new locations to you to find. That's what I would like to see done, as something that would, one, have this sort of collaborative game-wide community effort to find the new divination card locations, but also a number of things that, a number of divination cards that have changed in value over time could have their drop locations changed to be something that's more suitable to what phase of the game they're an interesting item in now. A good example for this would be the divination card, the Dapper Prodigy. The Dapper Prodigy gives you a random item level 100 6-linked armor piece. It's not influenced, and it used to be much better than it is now, because it used to be something that could be an endgame item. Whereas nowadays, it's a stepping stone item. You get yourself a set of Dapper Prodigy, you craft it with some essences, you use it until you can afford something truly great that's got influence mods on it. So a divination card like the Dapper Prodigy would be perfect, in my opinion, to distribute to map bosses of 1 Watchstone or 0 Watchstone maps. And just say, all right, every 0 Watchstone map boss that you do has a chance to drop a Dapper Prodigy. And not tile set locked, certainly not locked to a map like Residence that may not be on the Atlas in the future, but even when it is on the Atlas, is one that may be reasonably high tier, especially because it's got a mechanically non-trivial boss. If they made it so that that was that was just available in every 0 Watchstone map, then a player that was determined to get a set of this for themselves could just go, all right, well, you know what? I've worked out that it takes about 100 0 Watchstone maps in order to get a set of the Dapper Prodigy. I'm going to farm on at League Start in solo self-found. Or another player might say, I'm going to farm until I get 3 of this card, then I'm going to trade for the rest of them. So yeah, that would be something I'd like to see done. And with divination cards in particular that give an item that used to be somewhat uber but that isn't anymore, those should be put in much more accessible locations. On the flip side, things that are much more at the like really uber end of items, like say the divination card the demon, which drops a 2 implicit corrupted headhunter, that's the sort of thing that should be moved to a place like say 8 mod corrupted the feared. That'd be the perfect place for that, rather than having it drop from the Katava map boss. Anyways, that's enough for my opinions. Let's go back to what was discussed in the podcast. There's a bit of talk about fixing up splinters. So splinters have been something I've hated for a long time in the game. Just the amount of clicking. And I've had the quite often unpopular opinion that I much prefer the system that was used for the Trial Master even to the system that's used for breaches, where, you just either you get the boss or you don't, and it's just random. That's because I hate splinters that much. There's a bit of talk, though, that splinters will change so that when you complete the breach, you will get a pile of splinters. There'll be a bit of balancing for how to work in parties, and I kind of feel the ideal thing would be that it just drops in 2 stacks. So if your level of success in the breach is that you get 13 splinters of Zoth, then you just get 1 pile of 8, 1 pile of 5. If you're playing in a party, then they allocate randomly. If you're playing single player, then obviously they're both going to allocate to you. I think that would be the ideal setup. Likewise for legions and things like that. There's also a lot of internal talk about not rendering items that are being filtered. And I think this is like one of the most important changes they should make. So what they're talking about here is having it so that if you have set your loot filter to not show a Necromancer Silk that is 3-linked, and a 3-link Necromancer Silk drops, then, obviously you can override your loot filter and still see it, but in the absence of doing that, there will be no graphical depiction of that item dropping at all. So there won't be an item created on the ground for it that'll appear and that will slow down your PC. I think this is probably the single most important performance upgrade that Path of Exile needs to make, in terms of just from a technical quality of the game. So there's a little bit more that's said about the Fortify overhaul that was mentioned earlier, but this was where they clarified that the plan was to link the intensity of Fortify's damage mitigation on you to the quantity of melee damage done. I have one real concern about this, and that real concern is that if you're the first person to be hit in an encounter, then you're not going to have access to Fortify. Which is still currently the case, but champions have a way around it. I want to see the exact package that's proposed there, but ultimately I think this is something like Fortify is in a weird place where it's a defensive layer that's available for everyone. I do feel that there needs to be some replacement for it. I don't think it should exist in its current form, but I also think it would be worse to remove it without replacing it with something else. So, this is the ways that casters can get Fortify with, say, Whirling Blades linked to Fortify support, or with Shield Charge. So that's something that I think they should, give a lot of serious thought to. And again, that comes down to the earlier discussion we had talking about the questions related to player defenses in general. So for Harvest, there was a little bit of discussion later that came up about, deterministic crafting in general and Harvest specifically. And Chris's attitude was, we like there being a degree of deterministic crafting, but don't want deterministically crafted items being the best items in the game. I agree with that, and I'm quite happy with the current state of multimod, and also a number of other similar sorts of mechanics. Obviously, there's people that just want to focus on getting the maximum character power that they can that are not going to like that. But that's something that I like. And so talking about how Harvest was originally intended as an experiment, somewhat, and became a bigger experiment than they thought, and that Chris considers the biggest mistake being putting Harvest back in the game in 3.13, in an unnerfed form. I think, look, honestly, I thought Harvest was a terrible league myself, but this is something that's been discussed to death. then yeah, I think that it's just those things like augments and especially remove ads were so powerful that they rendered all other rewards in the game irrelevant pretty much. Uh, then there's an interesting comment that came up a bit later, still on the same thing. So if you can get items through crafting, then why kill monsters? We're going to fix the game so you kill monsters for items. This one's interesting in that ultimately Path of Exile's got this really difficult tension where, on the one hand, their crafting is the source of the most powerful items in the game usually, but then on the other hand, the more power that there is in crafting, the less relevance there is to item drops from normal monsters. And so there's this sort of balance where Chris was saying he wants to try and fix this in some way. Later on, there's an indirect Headhunter nerf that's mentioned. So this was not intended as a Headhunter nerf. It's not mentioned in the transcript or the Baeclast episode as a Headhunter nerf. But there was a fair bit of talk about monster aura stacking. So monster aura stacking being like where you've got 4 or 5 different rare monsters that each provide one of the ridiculously powerful monster versions of auras. So monster haste is plus 50% action speed, so it's 2.5. It's like full on Raider onslaught. So 2.5 times normal onslaught. Then as well as that, you've got the monster critical strike aura, monster increased physical damage aura. When you get 3 or 4 of these monsters together, you wind up with an overwhelming threat that can just absolutely smash a player in one hit. And they're saying that they want to reassess the pool of mods that are available for rare monsters, which would then indirectly, of course, affect players that are stealing those through the use of Headhunter. Lastly, there's a bit of a comment from Chris Orson about how, again, sort of mentioning how they have been really avoiding commenting on the Path of Exile subreddit lately because, it's just really become a toxic environment. And it's one of those things where GGG need to get feedback when players don't like the game, especially when they make a change and it's unpopular. But the Path of Exile subreddit has become so toxic that it's no longer useful for finding feedback on. I think that what GGG should do is send out polls to just each league find a bunch of the players that in the previous league were in the 12 challenge tier, a bunch in the 24, a bunch in 36, a bunch that don't get to 12 challenges, and just send them out extensive surveys and find out as best you can what their feelings are about the league, incentivize them to do those surveys, and potentially even even with things like paying them to do them and things like that. But just do it to a sampling of players and then use statistical analysis to work out what the actual opinions are. Because one of the things with the Path of Exile subreddit is that just the nature of Reddit, once it makes up its mind on something, any opinion that dissents from that will end up being buried in downvotes. And this is actually used quite a lot to, people that want to start up some sort of market hoax in the game. If you've got a unique item that you want to decrease the value of because you want to try and buy a lot of them, you think it's underpriced. One of the strategies you can use to do this is to trash talk it, get your whole guild to upvote that, the trash talking that you do, and anyone that comments against you, get your guild to downvote them aggressively. This sort of thing happened extensively in Synthesis with map sustain issues, and there was just Synthesis was dropping a fairly large amount of maps. I was selling a lot of maps, and you would have some people that were saying on the one hand, maps aren't dropping in one thread, and then on another thread they're boasting about how they got themselves a headhunter through selling maps. So there was all sorts of weaponization of Reddit that goes on, and that makes it a really difficult spot to get feedback. And that's something that GGG are dealing with at the moment. But basically, Chris's approach is to be very careful about which staff are put onto Reddit because he doesn't want the toxicity to result in any of them having a breakdown or anything like that, which gives a sense as to how bad that's gotten. Anyways, they were the takeaways that I had from the Baeclast. If you want a link to the transcription, I will definitely put a link to where it can be found over on Reddit. If you've got comments and questions, definitely fire away below. Otherwise, may Evalves be give you interesting results, and I'll see you next time.